One of the most mysterious cases in the criminal history of France began on March 21, 1991, when Jean-Louis Turquin called the police to report the disappearance of his 7-year-old son, Charles-Édouard Turquin. The father and son lived in a large mansion in Nice. The boy had his own habits. For example, he had a puppy and would feed it early in the morning before breakfast with his grandparents, whose house was nearby. That morning, not finding his son in bed, Jean-Louis assumed that the boy had woken up and, without making any noise so as not to disturb his father, had run off to his puppy. But the grandparents told him they had not seen the boy. The father then went to check his son's favorite garden, but Charles-Édouard was not there either. None of the boy's belongings were missing, neither clothes nor toys. In other words, the boy had disappeared wearing only his pajamas. The father quickly called the police. The man told the arriving police officers that he and his wife were both veterinarians. The couple had separated, although they had not yet finalized their divorce. Their son continued living with his father in a large house with 22 rooms, arranged like an English manor. The previous day, the boy had spent time with his mother. She brought him home in the evening, and Charles-Édouard and Jean-Louis went to bed not very late. Charles-Édouard slept with his father in a small room with 2 single beds placed side by side. After his parents' separation, he had refused to sleep in the children's room, saying it was too dark and that he didn't like it. The child often got up at night to use the bathroom, so according to Jean-Louis, he didn't realize until morning that his son had disappeared. The police called in handlers with search dogs. The dogs led the handlers from the bedroom to the gate of the house, after which the boy's trail disappeared. The logical conclusion was that Charles-Édouard had walked to the gate either on his own or accompanied by someone, after which he was placed in a car and taken away. The police didn't know how to classify the case. They doubted it was a kidnapping. There was no ransom demand and no signs of forced entry. But there were no leads to find the child either. No one in the neighborhood had heard or seen anything, even though it was a densely populated area. It seemed strange that no one had noticed a 7-year-old child at such a late hour. The investigation quickly focused on the boy's parents because both of them were behaving extremely oddly. The couple had not yet finalized their divorce, and their separation was very contentious. The police concluded that one of the parents might have kidnapped the child to gain leverage over the other. Michelle Turquin immediately accused Jean-Louis. She believed that the father had hidden their son somewhere to spite her, since he was the last one to see the boy. Moreover, just a few minutes after the search for the 7-year-old had begun, Jean-Louis announced that he had work that couldn't be canceled and that he needed to leave. A curious reaction. For his part, the father insisted that Michelle might have hidden the child out of fear of losing custody. However, it was unlikely that she was truly afraid of that. She rarely spent time with her son and often admitted to friends that she didn't know what to talk to him about. Right after Charles-Édouard's disappearance, she calmly went shopping. Despite her seemingly indifferent behavior, Michelle had an alibi. Having moved out of the family home a month earlier, she was staying with friends several dozen kilometers from Nice. She had spent the entire evening with them, and the friends confirmed her alibi. For this reason, the list of suspects quickly narrowed down to one person, Jean-Louis. 2 days after the boy's disappearance, the father was taken into custody. The police officers hoped to get a quick confession out of him, but they realized they had miscalculated. Even under arrest, Jean-Louis remained composed. He calmly told the detectives that he had expected to be arrested, that it was normal during an investigation, and he completely understood. However, he emphasized that this did not mean he was guilty of anything. The man was released and allowed to return home. Jean-Louis did everything he could to find his missing son. He put up posters around the city with photographs of the boy, offering a reward of 100,000 francs for any information that could help find him. But as the days went by, the detectives increasingly began to consider the possibility that Charles-Édouard had not simply been kidnapped but murdered. The father remained the sole suspect. Wiretapping his phone yielded no useful results. The police found themselves at a dead end, unsure of what more they could do. Michelle had no doubt that her husband had done something to their son, and she told herself that she had to extract a confession from him at any cost. She shared her plan with the police, and they suggested that she try to get Jean-Louis to talk while secretly recording him. They advised her to purchase a small Sony tape recorder and set a trap for her husband. Michelle made an appointment to see Jean-Louis at his office. She dressed as if she were going on a date. When she entered his office, she placed her handbag, with the recorder inside, close to them and began to put her plan into action. Michelle flirted with her husband, sat on his lap, and tried to seduce him in every way she could. She knew very well that this wouldn't be difficult. Jean-Louis, who had always been madly in love with her, would not be able to resist his feelings. And it was during their intimate games that Michelle demanded her husband tell her what he had done with the boy. She insisted, pressured him. The man told her what she wanted to hear. He confessed to killing their son. Jean-Louis told Michelle how he first gave the child a sleeping pill that he used in his veterinary practice. He didn't want to deal with blood, so he strangled Charles-Édouard with a tie in the bedroom and disposed of the body in the mountains. Michelle tried to find out exactly where the boy was buried, but her husband answered vaguely, giving only a rough description of the place that became Charles-Édouard's final resting spot. Jean-Louis told his wife she shouldn't think about it anymore because it was all in the past now. He said that Charles-Édouard had been a parasite, an obstacle to their love. But now, once Michelle returned home, they could have another child. After leaving Jean-Louis' office, Michelle told a friend about her unexpected visit and about the confession she had forced out of him. The friend immediately told Jean-Louis that he understood it was all a made-up story, but warned him he would pay dearly for this lie. He was absolutely right. 1 week later, on May 13, 1991, Jean-Louis was arrested. The man tried to deny that he had confessed to his wife about the murder, but when he was given a tape to listen to, a recording of his own voice, he admitted that he had said all those horrible things. However, he insisted they were not true. According to him, it was a kind of twisted role-playing game that his wife had dragged him into, and she had pressured him into giving those answers. She wanted him to confess, and so he did. In short, his defense boiled down to this: I confessed so that she would come back home to me. Indeed, what better way to convince a woman to return to her husband than by telling her you murdered their child? Jean-Louis was charged with the abduction and murder of Charles-Édouard. However, the taped confession seemed insufficient to detectives to secure a conviction. Therefore, they set out to uncover everything they could about Jean-Louis' life in order to understand how he could have committed such a horrific crime. Jean-Louis was born into a modest but loving family. He and his sister remembered their happy childhood with great fondness. Unfortunately, when Jean-Louis was 18 years old, both his father and mother passed away within just a few months of each other. As a result, Jean-Louis took on the responsibility of raising his sister. He had already been a serious, disciplined, and intelligent boy, but having to care for his sister made him even more determined and focused. His classmates described him as a very hardworking and mature person in many ways. Perhaps that's why he was so drawn to Michelle. She had just started her first year at veterinary school when Jean-Louis was already in his fourth year. There was something childlike and naive about her behavior. She was remarkably shy. This touched Jean-Louis, and he felt a strong urge to protect her. It was the first love for both of them. For Jean-Louis, Michelle became the woman of his life. His love eventually grew into an obsession. In 1975, the young couple got married. However, in many ways, they were not a typical couple. This thought first crossed the minds of their mutual friends when Jean-Louis opened a veterinary clinic in Nice, while Michelle began working as a veterinarian in Colombes near Paris. In other words, the couple was separated by 950 kilometers. They lived like this for 6 years, and it was only in 1981 that Michelle joined her husband in Nice, opening her own clinic next door to his. Business was booming. 2 veterinarians in Nice, a city full of ladies with little dogs. Jean-Louis worked day and night, sometimes 7 days a week, but his hard work allowed the family to live lavishly. Jean-Louis bought a mansion with a swimming pool for 10 million francs, about 1.5 million euros, drove a Rolls-Royce, and the couple dined at the finest restaurants. However, all their relatives insisted that by that time, the marriage had already started to crack. Michelle had affairs with men who were complete opposites of her husband, simply put, with marginal figures. One of them was a former dancer from America, Moise Brittelstein. Having lived a bohemian life on the Riviera for some time, he was now begging on the streets of Old Nice. He met Michelle when he brought his dog into her office. Jean-Louis found out about his wife's affair and decided to take a desperate step. Since it is said that circumcised lovers give their partners more pleasure, he performed the circumcision procedure on himself in his own office. He was ready to do anything to keep his wife. It was against this backdrop that Michelle found out in 1982 that she was pregnant. Jean-Louis jumped for joy because he had always dreamed of becoming a father. However, Michelle wanted to terminate the pregnancy, claiming that childbirth was painful and she would gain extra weight. Jean-Louis tried to convince her, but after exhausting all arguments against abortion, he threatened Michelle, saying he would kill her if she went through with it. He regretted his words, but Michelle was frightened and agreed to keep the baby. However, she promised to leave the family after the baby was born. Jean-Louis did not argue, as he believed that once she gave birth, she would change her mind. The man hoped that life would improve, but he was mistaken. The sad truth was that his wife no longer loved him, nor did she love the child she was expecting. Michelle complained to her friends about her unplanned pregnancy, describing it as if a cancerous tumor was growing inside her. Little Charles-Édouard was born in 1982. Many years later, Michelle claimed that when he was born, she of course loved him, but after childbirth she rejected the boy. Since the father worked a lot, the child was raised by his maternal grandparents, who lived next door to the mansion. Jean-Louis and Michelle, strangely enough, continued living together, or rather, in the same house. The mansion was so huge that they could live in it, go about their business, and never cross paths. Charles-Édouard grew up in a family where the parents didn't even have dinner together. They lived parallel lives with the little boy at the center. Is it any wonder that he grew up to be a very sensitive, shy, and melancholic boy, and very intelligent? At 7, he seemed quite mature, was fascinated by nature and insects, and dreamed of becoming an entomologist. The situation in the family tormented him, and he tried to bring his parents closer with gentle gestures. In his garden near the house, he grew beans, which his father adored, and strawberries, which his mother loved. This was his way of reconciling them, of bringing his parents together through their favorite things. Jean-Louis was irritated that Charles-Édouard was growing up so sensitive. To toughen up the boy, he strangled a chicken in front of him that his son had tamed. Furthermore, Jean-Louis told his son that he shouldn't love his mother because she had wanted to kill him when he was in her womb. Both the father and the mother used their son in their games to hurt the other. As a result of their conflict, the boy began to have developmental problems, such as dyslexia and involuntary urination. In 1991, after another quarrel, Michelle made the final decision to move in with friends and filed for divorce. But before leaving, she angrily told her husband that he was not the father of their son. Jean-Louis was stunned. A paternity test confirmed that he was indeed not the boy's father. Jean-Louis suspected that the father was Moise, Michelle's lover. The man struggled with the breakup and the news about his son, sending Michelle letters in which he begged her to come back home, but she refused to even hear about it. The day before the child's disappearance, he sent Michelle a telegram with a hidden threat of returning home. Otherwise, serious, irreversible events might occur. She didn't return, and at 7:30 in the morning, Jean-Louis called the police to report that Charles-Édouard had disappeared. According to the investigation, when Jean-Louis found out that he was not the boy's father, he had a motive to get rid of the child. After Michelle's confession, the police dedicated all their efforts to finding the child's grave. Based on the description provided by Jean-Louis, it was decided to search in Lucéram. For 4 days, 100 people combed through 8,000 hectares of forest, but they were unable to find a spot with freshly dug earth. It was suggested that Jean-Louis might not have buried the child. Since the man was a veterinarian, he had access to incineration plants and could have cremated the boy. However, searches at the local incineration plants also yielded no results. 9 months later, Jean-Louis was released from custody. The man went on a hunger strike and took it so far that he endangered his own life, which led to his release on bail. He returned home, and while going through some belongings, he found Michelle's diary with intriguing contents. His wife mentioned someone named Yosef, who was learning to read Hebrew and showing progress. She also wrote about purchasing a house in Tel Aviv. Jean-Louis immediately became suspicious and decided that Yosef must be Charles-Édouard. Convinced that his son was alive, he hired a private detective to observe his wife. Jean-Louis unexpectedly discovered that his wife had traveled to Israel several times, although she had claimed to be in Great Britain. He sent the private detective to Israel, to Ashdod, where Michelle had bought a house. The detective went from door to door, visited shops, and showed people photos of Michelle and the boy. He managed to uncover something. 2 hairdressers stated that they had seen Michelle with a boy who resembled Charles-Édouard. Jean-Louis' trial was scheduled for March 1994, but due to a new development in the case, it was postponed. The man and his lawyers loudly proclaimed that the boy had not died, but was living and growing up in Israel. The police were forced to conduct an additional investigation to confirm or refute this information, which significantly delayed the date of the trial. Then 2 months after the postponement, on December 24, 1993, Moise, Michelle's lover, passed away. He died in Nice under very mysterious circumstances. His body was pulled from the water while wearing an extremely heavy diving suit, making it impossible to swim in. The man's body was covered in bruises. The police were unable to determine what had happened to him. Finally, on March 17, 1997, the trial began because the police had been unable to confirm that Charles-Édouard was living in Israel. Michelle answered all police questions by stating that she had not kidnapped the child, and whatever she had done in Israel was, essentially, her own business and nobody else's concern. Thus, Jean-Louis was put on trial despite the lack of a body, physical evidence, or witnesses to the crime. The only thing the prosecution had was the man's confession, recorded on tape at a very delicate moment. Michelle, of course, attended the trial. She appeared to be depressed, but no more than that. It was as though her thoughts were somewhere far away. In essence, both parents showed no sorrow, as if the child had never existed and he had faded from their memory. When the jury listened to the tape of the man's confession, a dead silence filled the courtroom. It provoked mixed thoughts and emotions. Some admired Michelle for agreeing to seduce her hateful husband in the name of truth. Others believed that the woman had simply manipulated Jean-Louis into saying the words she wanted to hear, taking advantage of his dependence on her. In order to better understand what might have happened that night in the family's home, the judge made a rather unusual decision to transport all members of the court to the scene of the incident, namely to the family mansion, so that everyone could see with their own eyes the house and the bedroom from which the child had disappeared. As the jurors later admitted, this trip helped tip the scales in favor of the prosecution's version of events. Before the visit, they had imagined a spacious bedroom with 2 beds, but after seeing the actual room, they realized that the father and son had slept in a tiny room with 2 single beds pushed together. The jurors were puzzled, wondering how Charles-Édouard could have left the room without his father noticing. To turn the situation in his favor, the man's lawyers naturally invited hairdressers from Israel. They claimed to have seen Michelle with a child who was 8 years old. However, during cross-examination, the prosecutor immediately asked them how the child could have been 8 years old when at that time he was already 12. Overall, the witnesses' testimonies ended up harming Jean-Louis, as they made him the subject of ridicule. The man was found guilty. The prosecutor demanded a life sentence, believing that the deliberate murder of a child was the most horrific crime. However, Jean-Louis was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But this was far from the end of the story. After the verdict was rendered, the case went quiet for several years. But in 2003, a new chapter unfolded. A 45-year-old prisoner convicted of murder wrote a letter to Jean-Louis' lawyer. He claimed that another inmate had confessed to him how, along with an accomplice, they had accidentally run over the boy while fleeing after a robbery in a stolen car late at night. The boy, wearing pajamas, had been on the road in the middle of the night. The men put the body in the car and disposed of it at a cement plant near Marseille. However, this informant, who wrote the letter to the lawyer, refused to reveal the name of the potential killer and demanded to be released from prison first. The French authorities, however, did not succumb to the blackmail. And despite the informant having previously assisted the police in solving a double murder, he was denied his release. He was sentenced to 12 months in prison for refusing to provide testimony that could have exonerated an innocent person. Meanwhile, Jean-Louis quietly served his sentence in prison. He stood firm in his beliefs, never admitted to anything he hadn't done, and demonstrated exemplary behavior. But also, he found new love. Nadine Shaber, a dance teacher and mother of 3, learned about the court case involving Jean-Louis through the media, and his story deeply touched her. She believed in his innocence and obtained permission to visit the prisoner. Nadine went to visit Jean-Louis, and from that moment on, she visited him every weekend for several years. When Jean-Louis proposed to her, she happily accepted. The couple married in prison. Then, in March 2006, 56-year-old Jean-Louis was released. He had spent almost 10 years in prison after the verdict. Waiting for him outside the prison gates were Nadine and her children, and it was an incredibly happy moment. In 2012, the couple settled in Saint-Martin. Jean-Louis opened a veterinary practice with Nadine's help, and they enjoyed a peaceful life in the tropics. Until January 8, 2017, when Nadine, returning from her friends, discovered her husband's body in the bedroom. He had been shot in the back. There were spent cartridges nearby, but the murder weapon was gone. Also, there were shards of glass from a broken decanter of water on the floor. Of course, many versions arose, including revenge for Charles-Édouard. Some even suggested the most absurd theory that the man was killed by the grown-up Charles-Édouard himself. But that, of course, was nonsense. And who would seek revenge on Jean-Louis, considering that Michelle had died in January 2014 from a heart attack? There was no evidence to support this version, and investigators didn't believe it much. They suspected that the man had become a victim of a robbery. Some Martin may seem idyllic, but at the same time it can't boast of safety, and robberies, armed assaults, burglaries, and break-ins are not uncommon. Just 4 days before Jean-Louis's murder, 3 people had visited another veterinarian. They demanded money. Judging by the state of the rooms in the Turquin family's house, the killer was clearly searching for something in open drawers and cabinets. The back of the radio receiver was also tampered with, and next to the radio receiver was a knife that didn't belong to the family. Jean-Louis earned well and kept a relatively large amount of money in the back of that device. Detectives hypothesized that the veterinarian fell victim to a burglary gone wrong. It is likely that the robbers thought the owners wouldn't be home and would be at a party with friends. However, Jean-Louis was scheduled for knee surgery. He wanted to rest and preferred to spend the evening at home. Nadine left alone. When the robbers burst into the house, Jean-Louis grabbed a crystal decanter, swinging it to defend himself or fight off the criminals. They opened fire and killed the homeowner. They found a hidden stash in the radio receiver, took expensive watches and some jewelry, and then fled. Everything pointed to the fact that the police considered the robbery version as the primary theory. However, there was widespread shock when on April 28, 2017, Nadine was arrested. The reason was that gunpowder residue was found on both of her hands. The police believed that she could have either been the shooter or an accomplice, and it turned out that Nadine had a motive. After 17 years of marriage, the woman became tired of her husband controlling every aspect of her life, including her email, finances, and relationships with her children. Moreover, she had recently learned that he had made his sister the legal heir to all of his wealth, essentially depriving his wife of inheritance. Nadine had always been a submissive wife, but at some point she had had enough. However, she had thought of divorcing him, not killing him. None of the couple's friends believed that she could have committed the crime. Later, the woman always claimed that when she found her husband on the floor, she ran to him and tried to help, which is why gunpowder residue ended up on her hands. Investigators consulted experts and had to acknowledge that this could have been true. Additionally, she had spent the evening with friends and had not left. Therefore, the prosecution did not pursue the case against her. The last hope of finding Jean-Louis's killer rests with science, as a knife with male DNA, which was never identified, was found at the crime scene. To this day, we do not know what happened to Charles-Édouard that night, nor do we know who killed Jean-Louis in the West Indies 25 years later. This case will forever remain one of the most mysterious in the criminal history of France. Jean-Louis's friends hope that now, when neither Michel nor the biological father of the child are alive, someone will come forward with the full truth. They believe that Charles-Édouard is alive and living somewhere in Israel. Private detectives and independent journalists have not given up trying to find the boy in Israel, and one of them even managed to find a school document that recorded the full name of the boy, Charles-Édouard Turquin. However, it turned out to be another false lead. To be honest, I really want to believe that Charles-Édouard is alive, that he already has his own family, children, and has finally found happiness. Because otherwise, one has to come to terms with a very harsh reality. For 7 years, the boy did not live but merely existed, truly needed by no one. The parents used him to hurt each other, and no one thought about the feelings of the child. His short life ended in murder. But even after his death, few mourned Charles-Édouard, the kind, gentle, shy boy who loved animals in his small garden.